Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Not DnD, which is brought to you by EN World. As always, I'm your host, Jessica, and this week we have Danielle joining us to talk about their game At the Gates. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Very excited to have you here because the game is on back of kit now and has smashed through the goals, so congratulations. And if you're watching or listening, you can check it out on back of kit now. Links from the show notes are on your screen. But for folks that aren't familiar with you and kind of the work you do, could you give us a little intro into to who you are and how you're involved with the system in the game?
Sure. So I'm Danielle Lauzon, and I have been the system designer for the Storypath Ultra conversion from Storypath, which is Onyx Path's in-house system that we are using. And I have been kind of working on that system. I helped make it, and then I kind of took over tweaking it and upkeeping it with all the books. And then when we wanted to kind of streamline it and get it into a more kind of not necessarily simpler but cleaner looking system, I took over the design on that. And then so that is the system that we're using. And then At the Gates is the game that I pitched to Onyx Path to utilize the Storypath system as in a fantasy world. So
Perfect.
It is my creation.
I love that. So this is your baby right here that we're going to be talking about. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I love that. Before we dig into talking about At the Gates, I always get a little bit nosy just because I'm interested in designers and people that create games. And I'd love to know your story and your background with role-playing games. So do you remember the first tabletop role-playing game that you played?
I do. So I grew up in a family of nerds. My mom was a big video game player, and my brothers played Dungeons and Dragons. And the very first games I ever played were actually board games, but I did play in a advanced Dungeons and Dragons game with some friends in high school.
Okay,
that we would play kind of semi-regularly, and one of us would kind of GM and the others would play their characters. There were only like 4 of us altogether, and we just kind of, whoever was running wouldn't play their character and everybody else would play their character. But I'd say we maybe did like 5 sessions of that. It was not a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, that was kind of my first real experience with playing any kind of tabletop RPG.
Fab. And it obviously like started with Dungeons and Dragons, which is like quite a common gateway for other people, but I guess that opened the door for like other tabletop RPGs. What were the other games that you played kind of early on that inspired you as a developer?
So actually, yes, I did play other tabletop RPGs eventually, but the thing that actually kind of moved me away from Dungeons and Dragons into other game systems was LARPing. I met some people in college who were playing Vampire the Masquerade as a LARP, and I joined that little troupe, and then I joined a national fan club that was running that LARP, and I got really involved in that. And that's actually how I ended up writing for White Wolf, like CCP White Wolf way back in the day, was that my husband, who I met in college, was following one of the developers, and that guy was looking for, just people to send in submissions, wanted some new authors, and my husband encouraged me to send in a submission. I did, and I got picked up on a Mage book, Mage the Awakening book. And then from there, I kind of started picking up additional freelance projects and started working with Onyx Path when they started doing the Chronicles of Darkness 2nd edition stuff. And I've just kind of been floating in the industry ever since.
Fabulous. It's so interesting you mentioned LARPing, live action role playing, because I've met a lot of people that do tabletop role playing game and do LARP as well that are designers or developers. Do you think, how has LARP to kind of inform your tabletop design? Because obviously there is some overlaps the way we play, but there's also a lot of differences. So I was just wondering what that relationship was like for you.
I think it's interesting because in LARP you do design for the experience. You design
Mhm.
for how are people going to how are people going to react to the scenario that you've put them in? How are they going
Mhm.
to, how are they going to feel? How are you going to evoke an emotion? How are you going to evoke a thought process and get a genuine reaction out of somebody instead of just a thought, like okay, well, this is how
Mhm.
I should react, right? But like kind of you're absolutely moving towards the experience. And it has made me realize that for tabletop RPGs, when you're designing a game, um, the experiential play of playing in a tabletop RPG is not very different from designing
Mhm.
your LARP or, designing your plot points for a LARP
Mhm.
around the experience. And so I start thinking about, okay, well, how are people going to engage with this mechanic and what are they physically going to do at the table? Are they rolling dice? Are they looking up tables? Are they, and so it's helped me kind of, I think, streamline rules in a manner that allows for players to have a fun experience at the table where
Mhm.
there's a lot less I need the book right in front of me and I'm flipping pages and I'm doing this because I want them to be the physicality of what they're doing at the table to be like rolling dice, getting a result and
Mhm.
going, oh, I do this cool thing.
Yeah.
And then moving on to more of the story.
Fabulous. So story kind of first, and the mechanics are there to support the story and
Yes.
not get in the way, sort of thing.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Fabulous. That sounds like absolutely my sort of game, and that leads us really nicely to talk about At the Gates, I think. So,
Yeah.
um, tell me about At the Gates. What's the elevator pitch for it? If people haven't heard about it, haven't been on Back a Kit and had a look at the page yet, what's it all about?
So At the Gates is a game that is inspired by Japanese video games,
Mhm.
often in the US called JRPGs.
Mhm.
It is also inspired by the idea of stepping into a role where you start with something very minor and small, a small
Mhm.
task that you're supposed to do, and then you end up saving the world. It is the epic journey of starting out as just kind of a nobody
Mhm.
and moving into a position where you're the only one who can defeat, you know, the whatever awful, god creature that's trying to kill the world or
Mhm.
overcome, the horrible kingdom that's trying to take over every other nation or these things because of the circumstances that you're put in and the people you wind up finding along the way. And so if you like uh, I like to use this one as one of my like if you're not familiar with JRPGs,
Mhm.
never played one, that's okay. I
Yeah.
think I could safely say that 90% of people who are gamers have heard of The Hobbit or at least seen a Hobbit movie, seen the new
Mhm.
Hobbit movie, or read The Hobbit. And the experiences of Bilbo Baggins going from, I'm just trying to have a birthday party, and this
Yeah.
wizard shows up at my door and says, you're the only one who can help these dwarves reclaim their homeland. And
Mhm.
not even you're the only one, just I really want you there
Yeah.
as like the heart and soul of our party. And then winds up being the one who helps them save their homeland.
Mhm.
And then, comes back with all these stories. But really, they just, Bilbo starts out as just this kind of nobody hobbit and
Mhm.
then goes on all these adventures. And
Mhm.
that is very similarly the kind of story that is being told here or that we want people to tell.
Amazing. So yeah, like you said, don't need to know JRPGs to enjoy this and engage and be part of it.
Mhm.
But as it was inspired by that, could you talk through some of your inspirations and some of the JRPGs that
Yeah.
inspired you really for want I was trying to think of another word, but that's the only word I could think of. But yeah.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
I when I first started writing the game, I did not set out to be like I'm going to make a game that, harkens to these influences. Instead, I started coming up with, if I was going to make a fantasy world, what are some key important things that I want to see like
Mhm.
in the fantasy world? And, I want to see everybody is a person. There
Mhm.
is no like racial divide. That's not
Right.
just it's not a thing.
Yeah.
Um, even if you look different from other people, even if you have rabbit ears instead of human ears, even if you're, you know, made out of crystal instead of flesh, you're just a person. And
Mhm.
nobody looks at you as a different kind of person. And the things that divide people are the boundaries of where they live and the cultures that they have, which is very much more rooted in reality than, you know, you're an elf and I'm a human, and elves are
Mhm.
biologically different somehow, yet we can still reproduce with each other, which is super weird to
Sure.
me.
Yeah.
So
So
I was
no
like,
bioessentialism pretty
no
much.
bioessentialism. It's,
Mhm.
it is your culture defines, everything about you, and the things that
Mhm.
you've done in your past define everything about you. And then
Mhm.
beyond that, I wanted the concept of evil and um, good and things like that to be a conscious choice. You choose to do good things, you choose to do bad things. Nobody is
Mhm.
wholly one or the other.
Mhm.
And so, and people who do bad things often do bad things for what they believe are the right reasons,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And not everything's cut and dry, and not
Mhm.
everything is. I didn't want to create a fantasy world where you could, uh, successfully convince yourself that it was okay to engage in violence at any time because it was morally good.
Yeah. So it's not like, oh, they're goblins, so they're evil, so clearly it's okay to go and hack and slash. None of
No,
that.
none of
Okay.
that. And so I started with that, and then I started building elements, and I was like, okay, well, I want like a big thing that's going on. I started working on that. And the more I started working on it, the more I realized that I had, created essentially Final Fantasy summons. I had designed essentially a storyline that looked really close to a lot of Japanese inspired storylines where, these summons are also kind of an analog to, a nuclear arms race. And then I was like, oh man, I'm kind of pulling from a lot of these things, and it's a lot of the, fun fantasy worlds that I grew up with. And so I decided to just really lean into it and start
Mhm.
designing mechanics to support that feel of, the feeling of camaraderie between your party members and being able to do things together because of that camaraderie, and mimicking the way, magic works and all of that kind of
Mhm.
stuff just kind of came from my initial setting design while I was working on,
Mhm.
okay, well, this is going to be, you know, how I would like to do fantasy.
Perfect. So, like you say, Japanese RPGs influence it in terms of the principles that you use to create the setting and the world. One little fun thing I do want to mention that I noticed in that was inspired by JRPGs is mini games,
Yes.
because most JRPGs have little mini games in. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about how you've introduced that idea into At the Gates?
Yeah, so, it was actually I say last minute addition. We had gone through the manuscript, and, everything was written, and I was joking with some people on the Discord, and they were saying, "Oh, well, if it's inspired by JRPGs, is it going to have a mini game? Like, ooh, a fishing
Hmm.
mini game." And I was, like, maybe I could make a fishing mini game. And, we talked about it. And we're like, why not? It's
Love
something
it.
that I've never seen in another game. A mini game in a tabletop RPG is
Hmm.
like it's a little weird, right? Not a weird, but like there are certain elements of a JRPG that become a mini game anyway, like action economy or resource economy. And so why not mechanize a mini game? And so I took a lot of t- I say a lot of time. I sat with it for like a day and said, okay, what is a hallmark of a mini game? And one of them is that in the video games, they usually don't use the main mechanics of the game. So the main
Hmm.
mechanics of most RPGs are the magic system or the combat system, right? And so I was like,
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
but it still uses the tools, right? You use
Hmm.
the buttons on your controller or the space bar or something like that, right?
Hmm.
And they're often rhythm games. I was like, okay, so I don't
Yeah.
want this to have to be a physical rhythm game on a tabletop because
Hmm.
I don't want players to feel like they cannot do the game because they don't have rhythm. And also, how do you adjudicate
Sure.
that in an analog
Hmm.
setting? So I said, okay, well, the tools of this are D10s. So
Mhm.
we're going to roll d10s like you would for anything else, but we're not going to use any of the other mechanics from the game. We're going to create a small like comparison mechanic, and we're going to make it a fishing mini game, because then we can have like some back and forth push and pull between the
Mhm.
fish and the fisher. And then we can, design some like fishing rods and bait and stuff like that give you, benefits while you're doing this back and forth.
Mhm.
And then we're going to say you could actually use the system for anything that would require a back and forth. So if
Mhm.
you're doing negotiations, you could
Mhm.
utilize the system for that, right?
Nice.
Where there, you want more than just a single roll to determine the outcome of a negotiation, or even maybe like a war game or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, so we, wrote it as fishing. And then we also gave a lot of
Mhm.
things of like, why would you want to fish in your RPG? Like, what's the point of that? And we came up with some like, well, you may do it to impress somebody or to
Mhm.
solve a situation that would normally maybe be solved with like violence, but
Mhm.
instead you're going to do a competition,
Mhm.
and you're going to outfish your opponent. Or, somebody may be like, oh, I want to taste the best fish in the world, but nobody can fish this legendary fish. And
Yeah.
now it's an adventure to go collect this legendary fish.
Yeah, I love it. I think little fun mini games and side quests can be really good in games, especially when you have something big and epic going on in the world.
Yes.
To bring it down and to just give the story those ebbs and flows can be really nice in it. So I really like that, which is why I wanted to make sure we talked about that.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the main big story. So obviously you can go fishing, but that's not what the game's about. So you kind of briefly mentioned the principles that you decided on when you're building the setting, but could you give us an overview of the setting and the world and what's going on? What story are we going to be walking through in the game?
Sure. So the game is set on a continent called Everend, and the continent has 7 nations, and each of the nations has a an internal conflict that they are dealing with, which is generally caused by either bad politics or bad magic. One of those
Okay.
two things
Mm-hmm.
causes an internal conflict, and then they all have struggles with each other on their borders.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest thing that's going on is one of the nations has figured out how to summon creatures that we call demons
Mm-hmm.
from a place outside the world,
Mm-hmm.
and their magic is also kind of antithetical to the world. So when they summon these creatures, they cause big devastating effects, and they're
Mm-hmm.
using those big devastating effects to wage war on one of their neighbors. And the fear that any of these other nations could be next is driving these
Mm-hmm.
other nations to start researching how they can get their own summons so that they can protect themselves against this nation that is
Mm-hmm.
out for empire building.
Yeah.
So the things that come from summoning these creatures into the world, researching these creatures, often leaves a taint on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are some nations that are dealing with, you know, uh, a blight that's causing a famine. There's a nation that's dealing with their leader, their monarch doesn't believe that the demon magic is the way to do it, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
group of mages that believe it is, so they are secretly doing research. There's
Mm-hmm.
other nations that have the natural occurrence of what we call outlands, which is the space where the void where these demons come from and the world kind of collide, and they
Mm-hmm.
create this kind of warping of nature.
Okay.
And those outlands have always existed, but they are now encroaching and getting bigger. And so we have a nation that's dealing with encroachment from outlands.
Okay.
Um, and so there's a lot of different, political things going on, but there's enough information to where you could set your game in a single nation and
Mm-hmm.
solve its problems, or you could go between all nations and kind of solve this larger, what do we, how do we can't put summoning these demons back in the box that they came out of.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's gonna keep happening. So how do we make that workable and livable and not use them against each other in giant explosive ways?
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of lent into my next question there a bit, which was about the characters that the players would be in walking around in this world, about what nations they're from and where they are in the world. Can you talk a little bit about the characters? And you mentioned already earlier that people will start as people that are quite small, nobody, but can grow into this. What else is there to talk about with characters and how we create them?
Yeah, so we Storypath uses a path system. So you pick a heritage, which is one of the nations, or no nation, or maybe two nations that your parentage come from, and then you pick kind of like how you were raised, like in a vocation sense, like, you know, did you grow up as a merchant, you know, in a merchant family? Did you grow up poor? Did you grow up as a noble? You know, maybe you're a princess, but you hate your parents, or things like that. And so you choose that. And then there's a profession, which is kind of like the class that you would see in other games. And it is kind of your focus now on the way you interact with the world and the way you solve problems. And again, you come from these kind of various backgrounds, and you're kind of starting your journey. And, you know, whatever you are, you're probably not embroiled in something very big to start with. And then you learn about something big. And the fact that you have these professions and all of this, you know, training and background lends you to being the group of people who are capable of solving this problem and no one else. So, so yeah, that's kind of the overview of the characters you play. The professions are, like I said, they're kind of the classes. We have 5 of them. And we really specifically, I wanted them to have very clear roles of what kind of things you'll be doing if you play one. So we have a diviner who is a healer, and they're the main healer, but they also can be like a necromancer.
Okay.
And then we have, or even like a mentalist kind of character. Then we have a harrier, who is kind of like your rogue. They can be a thief, they can be a spy, they can be an assassin, they could be a skirmisher. You know, they could be your ranged fighter. Then we have a mage, who is not just, everybody in the world has access to magic. It's a magical world. But the mage is a person who's spent a lot of time studying it and learning to kind of control it in ways that no one else bothers to, right? You use your magic to like turn on the lights or heat up a cup of coffee, but you're not out there, you know, solving, you know, you're not doing genetics experiments, right?
Sure.
But the
Good.
mages are, right? Like,
Yeah.
and when I say they're doing genetics experiments, you know, they're learning about the world through magic and not just using magic as an everyday resource.
Right.
Then we have warlords, who are our like kind of our combat leaders, but also just leaders in general. So often a nation, nobility, things like that will be warlords. They are also, they can be, they're kind of tanky, so they support people in combat, and then they can also do some healing as an off healer. And then we have warriors, who can do, you know, they're the fighters, but they're also kind of diplomats and or weapon masters or blacksmiths or things like that. And they can be your, or shapeshifters. So if you have like an idea for like a shapeshifter character, your warrior has access to that. And so, yeah, they can also be like your barbarian style character. They do a lot of, they're like big mainline damage dealers, and they have a little bit of support for being a protection type character as well.
Fabulous. Well, that gives me a great idea of kind of the world and the people we're going to be walking through the world. But I want to talk a little bit about the kind of mechanics and the game. So you've mentioned that the game is using Storypath Ultra.
Yes.
So for people that aren't familiar with that, I know this game has a few tweaks and changes, which we'll talk through. But if people are completely unfamiliar with Storypath and how that works, could you give us a little overview of what that system is?
Sure. Yeah. So Storypath Ultra uses a D10 dice pool system. So you have skills and you have attributes, and you select a skill, or something prescribes a skill that you're going to use. Then you choose an attribute that best suits it, and you pair up your dot ratings in both of those. That's how many dice you roll. You're looking for 8s on the dice. Each
Mhm.
8 or above on the die is a hit. If you get a
Mhm.
10, you get 2 hits. You
Nice.
count up the number of hits you have and you compare them to a difficulty. Often the difficulty is really low, like 1 or 2.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is that often the role you're doing, whatever the action you're doing, may come with some unintended side effects called
Mhm.
complications.
Yeah.
And if you, and they are all rated 1 to 3. And so you can use hits first to overcome the difficulty and then use the rest of your hits to buy off those complications.
Mhm.
And if you can't buy them off or choose not to buy them off, then you get some kind of consequence of your action. Your action's still successful, but it causes some kind of story or maybe mechanical consequence for
Okay.
not buying off the complication. We also have your gear and your everything that would give you what are usually bonuses or dice adders. Instead, we give auto successes called enhancements. So as long as you get 1 hit, then you get extra hits equal to your enhancement.
Mhm.
Um, and there's some rules about how that stacks and stuff, but for the
Sure.
most part, it's just you get to add extra hits so that you can get kind of these big effects. And the way that that works is if even if you don't want to buy off the complication, even if you do buy off the complication, if you have leftover hits, you can then buy what we call tricks. Again, on a successful action, you can buy these tricks to make your action better. So you can either make
Mhm.
it more successful or you can stockpile your hits for a future action, or you can um, add a rider to your action, such as like, I applied this effect to one person and now I have all these extra hits. I'm going to use it to apply it to a second person.
Mhm.
Things like that. So there's a bunch of things that you can purchase with your extra hits that are tricks. And those are kind of really where you go from, oh yeah, I did my action successfully and the outcome is what I described originally, to
Mhm.
now I have, kind of this critical
Mhm.
success, what we call exceptional success, where
Mhm.
not only did I do the thing I described, but I did a bunch of stuff on top of it.
Mhm. Nice. What I like about this system is it very much wants to let you do the thing.
Yes.
It's the kind of system where you don't roll and go, oh no, you can't. The door's stuck. It very much says yes, you can do the thing.
Mhm.
And one thing in the guidance when running it, it often says that make a roll when it matters. Like a lot of the time, if a player wants to do something and it's something their character can do, yeah, you can do that thing. You don't need to roll
Yes.
for it. It's only when the consequences or we're doing something that would matter, and there's an element of risk or doing something cool with the story. So
Right. Or uncertainty of any kind, because
Mhm.
you're probably going to do it, but then we can add uncertainty in the sense of
Mhm.
complications where it's like, oh yeah, you can absolutely, the door's not going to be stuck. You're going to open
Mhm.
it, but there may be something on the other side that's
Yeah.
unpleasant. We're not sure if that's true, so go ahead and roll some dice and let's find out.
Yeah, I love that. So speaking of like running the game, if people are looking to run this and they've come from like maybe just doing D&D or something like that, what advice would you give to GMs coming to run at the gates?
I would suggest that first you take a look at, the system,
Mhm.
um, to familiarize yourself with it, but also kind of divorce yourself from the concept of failure or, success and failure, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of binary that happens in D&D. You either succeed or you don't. Um, and there are ways to try to get a success. There's advantage,
Mhm.
there's disadvantage, there's re-rolls and things like that, but it's all trying to work towards a success. Instead, try to think of it in terms not of success and failure, but in terms of taking actions and the results of those actions,
Mhm.
whether they are a success or failure. What will happen next because this person says they want to do a thing? So if you're the GM and you're saying, okay, I want to open this door because it's in front of me, okay, cool. It's not a question of can I or can't I open this door. It is a question of what happens because I opened this door.
Mhm.
Is there something on the other side? Does it trip an alarm and let somebody who's in here know somebody's coming through your door?
Mhm.
Does it have a trap attached to it? Does it open easily and nothing happens because of it? Well, maybe, at that point don't roll, but
Mhm.
always be thinking when somebody says, I want to do this thing, or can I do this thing? Say, not think, can you or can't you? Think, what happens? How does that affect the world? How does that affect the story? What is going
Mhm.
to be either the consequence of this? And also think of a consequence of failure. Like, okay, well, you are trying to do something really difficult, like,
Mhm.
jump from tree to tree. And what happens if you fail? Maybe you fall and fall into, a nest of critters that are upset. Right?
Yeah.
You made the jump though. You never failed to try to do the thing you're trying to do.
Mhm.
And even if you miss, there should be some story result because of that.
Mhm. I like that a lot. That's some good advice. Speaking about at the gates and the role of magic in the game, like we've already touched on it kind of a little bit and how it works, but could you explain what magic looks like in this world? Because it's different for what people would be used to, maybe in something like classic fantasy like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted people to be able to do is to feel like their magic is always successful. It always happens.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very hallmark of a video game, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
never fail to cast your heal spell on your buddy.
Okay. Yeah.
It happens, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's never a chance that you're going to fail at that. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
there's a chance that it doesn't heal as much, or it critically heals or something like that. But also, for most video games, unless the the defense, unless there's some special defense, you rarely miss. Like I cast my flame spell on the bad guy, it,
Mm-hmm.
it, it hits. It's not going to not hit. So how
Mm-hmm.
do I emulate that as far as, the magic system goes? So
Mm-hmm.
almost all the magic spells that you cast are things that you're not using resources to cast first.
Mm-hmm.
You're using kind of a timer. So there's a couple of things that you can always do called dynamic spells, and those are usually riders on a magical attack, or like healing your buddies or things like that. So when you make a magical attack, you may miss with the magical attack, and that's okay because you just try again,
Mm-hmm.
next time. And these add riders. So if I'm casting, fireball at a person, or my fire spell at an enemy, then I'm going to roll a magical attack. I hit, and then I add this kind of fire rider on it. And that's what the spell allows me to do. And the same with almost everything is either you just take the action and it automatically succeeds, or
Mm-hmm.
it gives you a rider on another type of action you were already going to take. You don't roll to make sure that your magic works though. The
Okay.
magic is the magic is always working when you cast it. There are some that are more powerful effects, and those more powerful effects have, a little bit of an artificial limiter on them that we could define in game in in world as all magic is kind of your connection to the world and how you're drawing on the magic of the world. And so these are just, they're more taxing. And so you can only do it so many times a day or a scene or whatever. But they're also there for balance reasons. Uh, and there's elevated spells. So they're a little more powerful than dynamic spells. And you can only cast each one of those once a scene. And then there are iconic spells, and these are like your big, powerful, amazing spells that do a lot of things. And again, they're not going to fail, so you can really only do those once a session.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in a situation where I used my cool iconic for the session already, but now we're in a boss fight and I really would love to be able to use it again,
Mm-hmm.
you can spend a resource that we call soul energy to refresh that spell, but you only have so much soul energy. So there's a little bit
Okay.
of choosing, you should use your elevated every scene because they're going to come back at the end of the scene. You should, intersperse it with dynamics because that's kind of your bread and butter spells. And then, if you wind up using an iconic because it was really useful in that moment, then you use it. And then later, if you need it back, or if you need to use an elevated again because this scene and the scene is going on for a while, you can spend soul energy to refresh it and use it again. And the other thing, though, that you use soul energy for is summoning demons. So that's the only place where you could fail a roll. You roll to summon a demon. But again, the magic always works. But if you fail the roll, it's about how well you summon it. So if because there are these kind of chaotic creatures. So if you fail your roll, you summon a demon, but maybe you can't control it.
Yes, that was my immediate thought. It's like, yeah, it can totally be there. However,
yes, exactly.
It has its own plans. Yeah,
it has its own plans. It's maybe not going to listen to you. And now this is a story problem because you've just brought an unchained demon into the world that's going to mess some stuff up. So yeah, those are what and then as you level, if you learn a spell, it's kind of the way that some other games do it, where it's like once you know ice, or like Final Fantasy VII, once you have the ice materia and you're using it a bunch, when you level it up, you automatically get the next level of the spell. So there is a level system of how powerful your soul rating is, which is called your echelon. And as that goes up, you just learn the next level of the spell automatically.
Wonderful. So this game is very much like I look at it, and it's calling out for a campaign because it's your characters can level and grow, and it's about how your character develops and becomes from humble beginnings to becoming this mighty hero. So as I mentioned, it's live on Back a Kit right now until the 6th of June, I believe. And so what do people get? Is there an adventure in there that can like help you run a campaign, or what's in the books?
So right now what's in the books are a lot of setting material to get you started, along with a lot of story seeds and ideas for if you want to run a game. Here's some troubles, some hooks, some things that you can kind of pull from, both in the setting chapter and then again in the chapter where we kind of walk you through how you would run this game. Character creation, all the magic, and then how to create antagonists, and a good smattering of antagonists and demons that you can just pull straight and put into a game. We don't have an adventure for it in the core book, just because there's only so much space, and we want to keep it as
sounds
trim
like there's
as
a
possible.
lot in there.
There is a lot. So we're part of the funding mission is to get some supplemental materials made. We've already made the game. So when you back the backer kit, you get access to the manuscript, which we'll be revealing chapters throughout the campaign. And then what we're really funding is a traditional print run so that we can get it into distribution, and then enough money to be able to make some additional products. So right now our stretch goals are adding some stuff to a companion book, but then we're hoping to also have some stretch goals to make an adventure book, which will have multiple adventures in it that you could pick up. Right now, there's also a really small starter adventure in a demo version that we released called At the Gates Ashcan version, which is on DriveThruRPG right now. It's $5 for the PDF. You could start playing the game immediately from that. It's got pre-gen characters, it's got a little adventure, and it's also got all of the pertinent rules for running and playing the game.
Fab. So that's like the little quick start that you can get to just start playing straight away.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, if any of that sounds interesting to you, person watching and listening, I would recommend checking out the Backer Kit whilst it's live. Because the best way to support indie tabletop RPG creators is to buy their stuff. But yeah, we're coming up to near the end of our time, Danielle. So is there anything else about the game you want to make sure you get the chance to talk about, or something I perhaps forgot to ask you about?
You've covered a lot in a short amount of time, surprisingly. I'm impressed. And you've covered pretty much everything that I think is the most important, aspects. There's a lot in the game. There's a lot we have still yet to reveal through the backer kit.
Exciting.
Yeah, we've been going through stretch goals. We just really, we just unveiled 3 new stretch goals that we're working on. The last of which is some additional material in that campaign, companion book that I talked about. And so, yeah, it's exciting right now. We're very close to. I say very close. We're close to 200% funding in the sense that like another like $6,500 would get us there. So, if you're interested, back for just the PDF, it's $25. Like, go for it.
Yeah, fabulous. And that is at the time of recording, because this will be going live on the 27th of May. So at this time, it may be a different funding level, but at the time of recording, that's where we are. So please do check it out if you're at all interested.
Yes.
Well, that's great to hear. Well, congratulations on it doing so well and smashing the goals so far. I do have one final question I have for you, which I ask everybody, and that's: do you have any recommendations for any other tabletop RPGs? And the rules, of course, are not a game that you've made, because we spent a little bit of time talking about Out the Gates today.
Sure.
And also, it obviously cannot be D&D.
Right. So I'm actually going to recommend Fabula Ultima. Fabula Ultima is another game that is inspired by JRPGs. In fact, its subtitle is a tabletop JRPG, like TT JRPG. It's a very different game from At the Gates. Its inspiration is more about simulating the feel you have for actually playing a video game. So a lot of the mechanics and the rules are about engaging in combat as a way to progress the story, as a way to advance plot lines, as a way to solve all issues. You engage in the combat mechanics, and then everything between combat is extremely narrative. There's almost no rules for that, because it's just setting up your next combat to solve whatever issue came up. It's a very quick read. It's very quick to get involved in it, and it's really great for one shots, but it's also good for campaign play. The creators of it are Italian. Emma is probably one of the most active creators I've seen on their Discord, where they have a Patreon, and they're constantly like releasing new updates and rules and mechanics and things for that to support the game. And they're very lovely people. So if you're a fan of what we've been talking about for At the Gates, you should also check out Fabula Ultima.
I would agree about Fabula Ultima. I recently just bought a copy to give to a friend for their birthday. So yes, and they're a big fan of JRPGs. So I was like, this is a good game for them.
Yes.
And next year, obviously, they'll have Out the Gates. So that's sorted for a couple of years. That's great. All right, Danielle, thank you so much for coming on and giving up your time to talk to us about Out the Gates. And thank you so much for creating Out the Gates. So we have another great story that we can tell and share with each other. So that's all for this week. Thank you very much to everyone that came along to watch and or listen. We'll be back next week with another indie tabletop RPG to talk to you about. Thank you very much. Bye.